Hello, everyone. We're at the top of the hour, and we'll just give a little bit of time for folks to join. All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to begin. My name is Rose Beasy. I'm a regulatory affairs scientist in the Office of Regulatory Affairs and Quality here at Duke University School of Medicine. Today, we're going to talk about investigational new drug applications. And workshop is a 2-hour workshop and will be in 2 parts. The first part will be on IND exemptions and pre-IND meetings. We will not have an intermission. We'll go directly to part 2, and that will be on IND preparation and maintenance. And my colleague, Andrea Burns, will do that presentation. During this discussion, you can use the question and answer function to answer your questions, and we have staff standing by to type out the answers. We will also, during our conversation today, give you the opportunity to participate in answering some practice questions. And in order to access those questions, you can go ahead and type in pollev.com/DukeU into either your laptop or phone, and you'll be able to access them. A gentle reminder that we are recording this seminar and it may be published online. So today's talk, as I mentioned, will focus on INDs. And because of that, we're going to begin with that federal agency that oversees INDs. And in that case, it's the Food and Drug Administration. So the U.S. Food and Drug Administration is a U.S. government agency. It sits within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And when clinical trials are investigating products that require an IND, there are 2 centers that oversee the INDs, and they are the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research and the Center for Biologic Evaluation and Research, known as CDER and CBER, respectively. So FDA during COVID's pandemic really was brought to the limelight, especially with regard to all of the products, including vaccinations, that they approved. So we learned that FDA's job is to ensure that medical products intended for use in humans, such as pharmaceuticals or medical devices, are sufficiently safe and effective before allowing them to go to market. One of the things I want to mention is that FDA writes the regulations that are relating to drugs, biologics, and medical devices. And today our focus is on INDs, and those regulations appear in 21 CFR Part 312. This is an overview of today's Part 1 presentation. We'll take a look at some definitions, and then we're really going to be focusing on walking through and helping you determine if a clinical study requires an IND or can be exempt from an IND, meaning you do not need an IND. And if time allows, we'll also go over some pre-IND meeting information. And again, we'll have scenarios that you'll get to practice on. So to begin with, these are the 4 key concepts we'd like to define. What is a drug? The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or the FD&C Act, is the main set of laws giving authority to FDA to oversee drugs, and it defines drugs as articles intended for the use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or other animals. In addition to that therapeutic element, it also includes substances that are intended to affect the structure or function of the body. So we might think of something like birth control. We're not really treating a disease in that case, but we are definitely impacting the function of the body. And then finally, it also includes compounds administered to blunt or provoke a physiological response, or to study the mechanism of action or metabolism of a drug. So we often think of challenge studies in that regard. And we'll see an example of that in one of our practice questions. So what is an investigational drug? So we've defined the drug, and now we're narrowing in on what makes it investigational. In this case, in the United States, an investigational drug is a drug that is not lawfully marketed in the United States as a drug, or an article that is lawfully marketed in the United States as a drug that is not used according to its approved label. So going back to COVID, you can imagine, it's a new virus. We don't really have any treatments, and some pharmaceutical companies are starting to think about creating products that might be used to treat a drug. Those would be products that are just the beginning of their development. They are not lawfully marketed. If they were used in a clinical study, they are investigational. Likewise, I might be a pharmaceutical company that has like an anti-inflammatory drug like Orencia. It's already on the market. It's approved for treatment in something like, say, colitis or rheumatoid arthritis, and I want to apply its use to COVID. Well, it's not approved for use in COVID, so it would be investigational if used in that context in an investigational study. So now we're drilling down into what is a clinical investigation, and this is defined in the Code of Federal Regulations, and it's listed here, 21 CFR 312.3b. It's an experiment in which a drug is administered or dispensed to or used involving one or more human subjects. Generally, a clinical investigation is done for research purposes to contribute to generalizable knowledge. And one of the concepts that we want to keep in mind is a clinical investigation, that context, that is a different arena than the practice of medicine. So if you are a physician that is treating an individual as your patient, and you are not in a clinical study, you can use a product off label, and that can be part of the practice of medicine. And we'll talk about that at length later. So getting to the meat of things, what is an investigational new drug application? It basically is a written request that you submit to FDA for their authorization so that you can administer an investigational drug to humans as part of a clinical investigation. And as we talked about with regard to the definition of a drug, it generally refers to both drugs and biologics. And so the point being, an IND is applicable to both drugs and biologics. Now, current federal law requires that a drug be subject to an approved marketing application before it can be transported or distributed across state lines. So FDA's authorization under an IND needs to be secured prior to interstate shipment of any drug that is not lawfully marketed. One of the things to keep in mind is that not all clinical investigations that use an investigational drug will require an IND. So I always like to start with the end in mind, and we're going to talk about non-lawfully and lawfully marketed products, but I want to explain to you why. So the IND exemption criteria starts with the understanding that you're doing a clinical investigation of a drug product that is lawfully marketed in the United States. That's your top bar. It has to be lawfully marketed, and then it will go into the exemption criteria that you want to meet. Whoops. So we're coming back to this point where we're going to kind of try and explain what is lawfully marketed versus not lawfully marketed. And again, we're here in the United States. So articles that are commercially available and lawfully marketed in the United States as drugs typically are synonymous with those that are FDA approved. There are a couple situations in which FDA approval may not happen and the drug is still lawfully marketed. That applies to some of the older prescription medications that were on the market prior to 1962, which was the time point whereby FDA needed to approve drugs both for safety and efficacy. And then also drugs that are marketed via an over-the-counter drug monograph are considered lawfully marketed. However, FDA approval is not required. We're going to start with our let's practice at this point. So again, those of you that may have missed it, first go around, please go ahead and use your phone and tablet and get to pollev.com/DukeU. And the first question we're going to discuss is offering some examples for you to determine if they would be included in the definition of a drug. And it may take a little time to load. Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to just go through this. It seems like a majority of people are recognizing that all of the above would fall within that definition, and we'll quickly explain why. So when we first introduced the definition, we mentioned that biological products were included, and so this modified cellular product is indeed a drug. We talked about how small molecules that are used to treat a disease state, such as the small inhibitor that's used to treat breast cancer, would be considered a drug. And then finally, we talked about this broadening beyond therapeutic intent, where you are provoking a physiological response or affecting the structure function of the body. And in this case, the ragweed extract used as a prick in the prick test would be eliciting a physiological response. So the answer here is D, all of the above. So great job. Next, we're going to test, give two opportunities to test your knowledge on what is not considered a lawfully marketed drug in the United States. So here we are. We've got these four, which is not a lawfully marketed drug in the US. And again, it looks like the majority of people are picking up on the fact that the answer is D. As you might recall, we mentioned that there's certain drugs that are over-the-counter drugs like Claritin that are considered legally marketed. We also know Lipitor is a branded statin drug. It is legally marketed in the United States. And then generics, if they have FDA approval, are also considered legally marketed. So in this case, the fact that this PI's lab added a phosphate group to this drug, doxorubicin, and they have altered the characteristic of that drug, that version of the drug has not been approved by FDA and it's not lawfully marketed. We're going to try one more. It's the very same thing, which is not lawfully marketed in the United States. Okay, and recognize that we use these practice questions as learning opportunities as well. So I own that we didn't really go over this, and so this is kind of a trick question. The real answer is Hydro Boost Hydrating Moisturizer by Neutrogena, that being because it is considered a cosmetic. The reason that the dandruff shampoo would be considered lawfully marketed is the element of this anti-dandruff drug that is included. We didn't talk about medical gas, but indeed a medical gas oxygen can be certified for the indication of treating or preventing hypoxia. And so a designated medical gas that is certified is considered to, in effect, have an approved marketing application. And then this Opdivo by BMS is a lawfully marketed drug. This slide introduces what I call a nice flow chart to help you crystallize in your mind the decision tree when thinking through if your investigational study requires an IND. So as you recall, to be eligible for exemption criteria, you have to be using a lawfully marketed product. So as such, if it's not legally marketed, you need an IND. That's just straightforward and clean. If it is a legally marketed drug, your need for an IND is a little bit questionable. You may or may not need an IND, and this often depends in part on the intent and the degree of risk associated with the use of your investigational drug. So we're going to go into talking about on-label versus off-label. And here, obviously, if you're in that space of on-label or off-label, your drug is marketed. And we're going to need to tease through an understanding of what's meant there. So FDA approves drugs to be used in a specific manner, and that manner is defined in the drug label. So when you're using your drug on label, you're using it according to how the product should be used per FDA's approval. I've listed here 2 websites. The first, they're both databases that will pull up drug labels so that you can pull up drug labels to see them. The first one is Drugs at FDA. That includes all the labels for drugs and biologics regulated by CDER, and the other is Daily Med, and that one includes all labels for drugs and biologics. When you're determining if an IND is needed, it is important for you to look at the label to be able to see if you're using the investigational product per label, or tease out what are the differences so you can assess the risk that you're introducing by those changes. So here we're just showing a summary page of a product known as Bavencio. And this is a monoclonal antibody. It's a solution. It's given by IV for certain types of cancer. And you can see that it's got a series of headings that help you understand how this product has been approved by FDA for use. So in this case, it is approved for adults and children 12 and up for metastatic Merkel cell carcinoma. In addition, it is also approved for locally advanced metastatic urothelial carcinoma. And then it dives into specific criteria. So it's very, very specific what type of patients are to be treated, what type of disease state this is indicated for. Then we talk about dosage and administration. How much do you get? How frequent do you get it? And how long? So if it's an antibiotic, I might only get it for 3 weeks, whereas if it's an oncology drug, I may take it until I stop responding. Then we talk about dosage forms and strengths. So for example, tablet, capsule, and then the dosage level. Contraindications, none are listed here, but oftentimes it's something to the effect of, you're not hypersensitive to the drug. And it might often say, you can't be used with these other drugs. And then the warnings and precautions, which would talk to when you want to withhold or permanently discontinue your drug. And finally, end in with adverse reactions that are based on what was seen in the clinical trials that supported the approval and what those were seen within the various patient populations. And it's really important that I'm bringing this to your attention, because these are the things that you would assess when you're looking at the differences that you'll be using your investigational product compared to the label in your study. So on label is just what it means. You're following the label. You're using it for the same indication, same dose, route of administration, patient population, drug formulation, and drug combination comes into play. Sometimes labels will say you can use this drug in combination with another drug. Studies involving on-label use of a drug most often do not require an IND. FDA knows it's safe. They've already approved it for that use. They are not concerned. The caveat is, as long as the data that are going to be collected are not intended for use in a marketing application or to change the advertising. Off-label use is any difference from what is approved in the label. And that includes drug combination. And as we stated, that concept of on-label and off-label when we're assessing risk is in the context of a clinical investigation. if you are a physician and that product is lawfully marketed, you are free to use that product as you see fit. So we're going to practice again. And this is really, I like this particular practice question because it's going to talk to you about what an approved product label, the labeling of a product, and then it's going to present 4 examples of a type of study, and your job is to figure out which of these studies would be per the label. So here we have an FDA approved drug called HepX. It's approved for intramuscular delivery in people 18 to 65 years of age who've been exposed to hepatitis C. Which of the following is considered on label? Okay, I know this was a lot to read, but I can see that C is taking the lead, and indeed that is the correct answer. Here we've got subjects within the age range of the approval, which is 18 to 65. These folks have been exposed to Hep C, and they are receiving it IM. The reason that A would be considered off-label is because they've combined it with Viread, and our product label summary above in the blue strip does not mention that combination. The reason B would be off-label is because they're receiving it sub-Q and it's approved IM. And then finally in D, these folks have been exposed to Hep E, and we are approved here for Hep C. All right, going back to our flow chart and remembering that if it's not legally marketed, you need an IND. If it's lawfully marketed, the need for an IND is questionable. We've talked about the fact that if it's on label, FDA knows it's safe, an IND typically is not required, with that caveat of no marketing application or change in advertising. And then we get to this place of off label, and it depends. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at those exemption criteria. And so as we've mentioned, and I know it's kind of beating a dead horse at this point, but the first hurdle for you to even consider if your study is IND exempt is that you're using a lawfully marketed product. And of course, here it is stated again. And then we'll go through, you've seen in our flow chart when we're saying we're using a lawfully marketed product and we're using it on label, we're always adding that caveat that it's not designed to support approval of a new indication or change in label, and it's not to support a significant change in advertising. That's where those come from. But the next part of this talk is really going to focus on the criteria that's probably most challenging. And that is your study introducing a change in how you're using that investigational product that's going to significantly increase the risk or decrease the acceptability of the risk associated with that use of the drug in your patient population? And what I want to call out to you here is the exemption criteria call out route of administration, dosage level, patient population, and other factors. So we're going to look at each of those separately. Then the last two are easily met. Whenever you're doing an investigational study, you need to be in compliance with the IRB and ICF regulations. And of course, you're promising that you're not going to promote your investigational drug before it's been approved or shown to be safe and effective. So as I mentioned, we're going to drill into the third exemption criteria when we're trying to evaluate the risks involved in the off-label use or the use of a new drug or a new drug combination. And so again, these are the 4 or 5 criteria that we're going to look at. And we're going to lean on guidance documents that FDA has issued. And these are exceptional. I would recommend that you take a look at them. I think they'll really crystallize what we've talked about today. The first one is more about treatments in cancer. It is also, it's very, very well written. It gives you an insight as to how FDA thinks about IND exemptions and the risk-based approach that they take. It gives a number of examples of when an IND is needed versus when an IND is not needed. And we're going to go through those 5 categories that I mentioned here. And the language comes from one of these 2 guidance documents. So the first off is route of administration. And what FDA is saying is you may be introducing risk if your investigational study is going to change the formulation or route of administration from what's been approved. So their example here is we've approved an oral drug. So say it's a syrup or something, and you're going to change it into something that's IV or maybe inhalation. They're saying that that may increase the risk. And they're concerned with things like sterility or increased local concentration or perhaps increasing the chance for hypersensitivity. So these are outside the scope of what FDA has looked at, and you may be introducing risk that they see as a significant risk and would therefore warrant the need for an IND. Dosage level. This again is text that comes from the guidance document. And here they're talking about, we often think of increased dose as leading to toxicities, but a decrease in dose can also be problematic because you will be subtherapeutic. So in this case, they're talking about administering a low dose of a vaccine, which could either induce tolerance to the vaccine or make it so that the vaccine doesn't protect you against the infectious disease it was created to prevent. FDA also recognizes that oftentimes you're looking at new patient populations. You might be looking at a new indication. You might be looking at a younger or older patient population. So they drill into the acceptability of known and unknown risks across various patient populations. And here they talk about increased or decreased age. You think about a child, their body is developed at a different rate than an adult, so their way of metabolizing a drug may be different. They talk about decreased renal or hepatic function. Oftentimes drugs are eliminated through the kidneys or they're metabolized through the liver, and if you don't have high functioning organs, that could be problematic and you're introducing risk. They also talk about concomitant therapy. And so here we're again reminding everyone that initial clinical studies that involve new drug combinations that aren't supported by literature, so you can't see publications that speak to the safety of that combination, generally will not be IND exempt. FDA mentions in their guidance document this concept of synergistic toxicity, and really what they're saying is one agent can interfere with the metabolism or elimination of another agent. And they may go so far in their review to suggest that you do preclinical studies prior to doing this combination in humans. Finally, I want to touch on the fact that we've always talked about the need for a drug to be lawfully marketed, and FDA recognizes that they would like to offer some latitude in that. So you are able to make what they call low risk modifications to lawfully marketed drugs. That would include like changes in color or scoring, and oftentimes that's needed if you're trying to create a blinded product. There are instances, and you need to think through packaging, where some products are more sensitive. Perhaps they're sensitive to moisture or light. And so your changes, you wanted to keep in mind those types of criteria as well. Finally, I'll end that when it comes to using a placebo, as long as the study meets the 5 IND exemption criteria, the use of a placebo is fine, and the study can be IND exempt. So let's build on our knowledge. And again, these sometimes can be teachable questions. Do you have to go to the FDA to get an IND exemption? We have not talked about this. And so we will talk about it now, but indeed you do not need to go to FDA to get an IND exemption. And I'm going to explain the two pathways that sponsor investigator may choose to take. So just to pull again from those two guidance documents, according to FDA, because the assessment of risks involved in a therapeutic procedure is an everyday part of the practice of medicine, they believe that the individual investigator is really set up and knows and can make the determination of the applicability of the exemption. And they're speaking to, what kind of risk you're introducing to your patient. So they really trust that that investigator is well placed and has the expertise to make that call. So when they're making their determination, they may have decided, they feel very comfortable with the way they're going to be using their investigational product in their study. But of course, as we've mentioned, you need to have IRB approval. So they may opt to go to the IRB and give the rationale to the IRB why they believe that their study is exempt. And they would go through those 5 exemption criteria that we've seen. Of course, we recognize that they know that they're using a lawfully marketed product. And the IRB would take that under consideration. And if they agree, then this is a one and done, and the sponsor investigator can proceed with their study. However, if the IRB disagrees, then the sponsor investigator needs to go to FDA. So there is the risk, if you were to take this approach, that it could be a 2-stepped process. So we know that oftentimes time is money, and we really have milestones and timelines that we have to hit. And so your sponsor investigator may opt to go directly to FDA, and they would do that if they had time constraints, because they know FDA, in this case, makes the final call. Oftentimes, industry partners might require, before they will donate the drug or release funding, to have FDA's determination. There are times when the sponsor investigator may not feel 100% confident in his determination regarding an IND exemption, and he might just want to have FDA's determination. I find that, and it's been long-standing, people, when they go to submit their grant applications, like to have this IND exemption letter or FDA's determination as whether an IND is needed already available, to show that they really have a solid understanding of the regulatory requirements for their study. So those are all reasons you might go directly to FDA. And again, FDA is going to take the same approach that we've talked about already. They're going to look at these criteria: route of administration, patient population, dose, drug combination, and drug modification, just like the sponsor investigator did, to evaluate the risk that's being introduced. So what is FDA's review process? The most conservative way to go would be to the formal process, where you're actually submitting an initial IND application with an exemption request to FDA. This puts FDA on a 30-day clock, and they will, in the end, either determine that an IND is not needed and you will get an IND exemption letter, or they will determine that an IND is needed. And if there are no clinical hold concerns, you will have an active IND, which is beautiful, because then you've got that checked off. All you need is your IRB approval and you can proceed. There is an informal process. Not all review divisions are willing to participate in this type of process, but some are. And the benefit of this is it's less work up front. You can just kind of informally provide an email to the appropriate review division. You may get a faster response, and you can request FDA's written response, so you have documentation. So if you were to go through the formal process, you would submit a cover letter, and that would include the rationale for your IND exemption. And then you would include all the documentation you need for an IND application. In your cover letter, you would state that you believe at the outset that it meets IND exemption criteria. And just like you did for the IRB, you would outline under each of those 5 criteria your rationale for why. And again, your biggest focus would be on that third and discussing the fact that you have not significantly increased the risk to patients. The informal process, I typically like to email rather than call, so I have documentation. You explain the situation, ask if they would be willing to do an informal review, and then I would caution, you want to be sure that the protocol team has finalized their protocol, then you can go ahead and send that synopsis and full protocol for review. And we have found that FDA will respond within about 2 weeks. So the informal process, where do you even begin? I provide 2 websites here, and they will bring you to the various links to the various offices, and then within those, the various divisions. How do you determine which division to contact? You really want to think about how your drug is being used. So, for example, I often pull midazolam as an example. If I'm using midazolam for seizure, I would go to the Division of Neurology. If I'm using midazolam as an anti-anxiety, I would go to the Division of Psychiatry. So let's practice. And this question is, in which of the following scenarios can you proceed with your study? It looks like this is not your first time at the rodeo, because yes, you need IRB approval, and you always need IRB approval. And of these 3 examples, that's the only one, and C is the correct answer. So of course, you know, we've mentioned that the investigator in B determines whether the study meets an IND exception criteria, but of course, they need institutional review board approval as well. And for A, while yes, it's great to go to FDA, you also need IRB approval. So it is the correct answer. I'm just checking our time. We've got 20 more minutes, so we're going to dive into some specific issues. These are kind of special cases that may come up, and I think they're a little bit outside the scope of a typical drug, and so often investigators may believe that an IND would not be needed. And again, this is addressed in the IND determining whether human research studies can be conducted without an IND. In the interest of time, we're going to bypass endogenous compounds in live organisms, but again, I encourage you to go to those guidance documents to learn a little bit more about that. And we're going to focus first on dietary supplements. So if we go back to the definition of a drug that we reviewed earlier, you will recall that drugs are not limited to compounds intended for therapeutic uses, and they're also intended to affect the structure or function of the body. Dietary supplements are a unique category of product, and they fall somewhere between a drug and a food. Under the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, a dietary supplement is not considered a drug and is not subject to pre-market approval requirements for drugs if the intended use for which it is marketed is only to affect the structure or function of the body. And so we'll be honing in on the use of a dietary supplement as a drug in a clinical investigation. So here again, the need for an IND is determined by the intent of use. If the dietary supplement is intended only to affect the structure function of the body and not for therapeutic purposes, it is not considered a drug, and therefore no IND is required. So examples here would be the use of calcium on bone mass because you're affecting the structure function of the body, or the effect of fiber on bowel regulation. However, if the use of a dietary supplement is for therapeutic purposes, and here we're again talking about the ability to diagnose, cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent disease, it is considered a drug and an IND would be required. And examples here are calcium to prevent, here we're with the prevent disease of osteoporosis, or fiber to treat diarrhea. And the thing to keep in mind here is that although a dietary supplement may be lawfully marketed as a dietary supplement, it is not lawfully marketed as a drug. So when we think back to that flow chart we talked about, you're on the left side, it's not lawfully marketed, and so you need an IND. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about radioactive and cold isotopes, which can sometimes be used to obtain basic information about drug metabolism, human physiology, or biochemistry. Radioactive drugs can be used for certain basic research without an IND in cases where they are generally recognized as safe and effective. And this is called out in 21 CFR 361.1. And in this case, they are overseen by the Radioactive Drug Research Committee, and there is a guidance on this, the RDRC Human Research Without an IND, and it has a great question and answer section. Regulations here apply to radioactive versions of both approved and unapproved drugs when the requirements are met. And there are no specific regulations for cold or stable isotopes, but because the risks involved with cold isotopes are generally lower than radioactive isotopes, FDA does not require an IND for studies using cold isotopes that meet these criteria. The criteria are that the research is basic, that it does not cause a clinically detectable pharmacological effect in humans, and that you've minimized the total amount of radiation to the smallest radiation dose practical to perform your study. Finally, it's important to note that IND regulations apply to all clinical investigations, regardless of the intent of the study, whether it's to commercialize a product or if it's simply for research purposes with no commercial intent. Some investigators think that if they are not planning to market the drug and that they are just using research, they do not need to require an IND, but that is not the case. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about cells in human tissues. I will say that we could do a whole workshop on cells in human tissues, so we're just going to touch lightly on it here. But these are articles that contain or consist human cells or tissues that are intended for implantation, transplantation, infusion, or transfer into a human recipient. And the regulations that address this are 21 CFR 1271. HCTPs are not marketed as drugs, but they are used to treat patients. And so what does this mean for research with HCTPs? So first, let's get a sense of what are examples of HCTPs, and they are listed here. As we've said, they consist of human cells or tissues, and that we've talked about their intended use. And these are some examples: tendon, bone, skin, heart valves. And here we'll talk about what is not an HCTP. Vascularized human organs for transplant, whole blood or whole blood components, secreted or extracted human products such as milk or collagen, minimally manipulated bone marrow for homologous use and not combined with another article, cells, tissues, organs derived from animals other than humans, and then blood vessels recovered with organs for use in an organ transplant. So when do HCTPs need an IND? These are regulated solely under 361 of the Public Health Service Act, and they do not need an IND if the following criteria are met, and it's all of these criteria: that the HCTP is minimally manipulated, that it's intended for homologous use, meaning its use is the same basic function in the recipient as it was in the donor. The manufacture of the HCTP does not involve the combination of the cells or tissues with another article, except things like water or things for preserving or storing the agent. And then finally, either the HCTP does not have a systemic effect and is not dependent on the metabolic activity of living cells for its primary function, or it has a systemic effect or is dependent on the metabolic activity of living cells for its primary function, and it is for autologous use, meaning the donor and recipient are the same, or for allogeneic use, meaning it's in first or second degree blood relative, or finally, it is for reproductive use. So let's try and dive in a little deeper into what are we talking about for those first two comments, minimally manipulated and intended for homologous use. There are two definitions of minimal manipulation, one that applies to structural tissue and one that applies to cells or non-structural tissue. They both focus on whether you are altering the properties of the tissue that contribute to its function. Processing that alters the original characteristics of the HCTP raise increased safety and effectiveness concerns because there would be less basis on which to predict how the product would function after transplantation. And as we mentioned, intended for homologous use means the repair, reconstruction, replacement, or supplementation of a recipient's cell or tissues that performs the same basic function in the donor as the recipient. So as I mentioned, there are, you can find guidance documents on HCTPs. And if you're interested in looking more, this was just a very basic introduction. So we're going to spend the last little bit of our time looking at some case scenarios and giving ourselves the opportunity to test our knowledge. So for each of these case scenarios, and I believe there are 4, we're going to ask the following 3 questions. The first, is this eligible for an IND exemption? And remember, eligible means, is it lawfully marketed? What is off-label in the case? And then what kind of documentation, rationale is what we're meaning, would you provide to the IRB or FDA to show that you have not significantly increased the risk? So in scenario 1, we have an investigator that plans to treat lung cancer patients with 3 doses of a checkpoint inhibitor called zizumab. They're going to give it 2 days apart at the indicated dose prior to tumor extraction. And then after tumor resection, they're going to examine the changes in the immune infiltrates of the tumor. Now, zizumab is FDA approved for weekly use in patients with lung cancer after resection. As we mentioned, they will be using it at the approved dose. So the first question is, can this study be considered for an IND exemption? And remember, IND exemption, we're talking about, is it lawfully marketed? So we say that it is FDA approved. So the answer is that it could be considered for IND exemption, and the answer here would be yes. So what in this case would be considered off-label? I found this a little bit challenging, but I agree wholeheartedly that dosing was something that was off-label because it is approved weekly, but they were going to be giving it every 2 days. And also, they were going to give it prior to resection rather than approved after resection. So I think dose is the correct answer. So what kind of documentation would you provide to the IRB and or FDA in support of an IND exemption? And basically, it touches on those very things that are considered off-label. The dosing frequency of going to every 2 days rather than weekly, and the safety of using it prior to resection. All right, we're going to have a scenario 2. This scenario is using a supplement. So here we are, we're an investigator, and we plan to conduct a trial to assess the effectiveness of commercially available probiotic to treat chronic fatigue. And they're going to be used as its recommended package. So here we are, we're treating a disease and we're using a supplement. Can this study be considered for an IND exemption? The answer here is no. As we've mentioned, supplements are not lawfully marketed as a drug, and so they would sit in that left-hand side of our decision tree, and they would not be eligible for IND exemption. And here we say it's not using a probiotic that's legally marketed as a drug. In the case for a dietary supplement, the need for an IND is determined by intent. And because this was a therapeutic intent, it was considered a drug. It's not lawfully marketed, can't be IND exempt. Okay, here we are. An investigator plans to a study in which patients with type 2 diabetes will receive either drug A, drug B, or the combination. Drug A and B are FDA approved for the treatment of type 2 diabetes, and both drugs are going to be used according to their approved dose. Neither drug mentions the other drug in their respective package insert or label. Can this study be considered for an IND exemption? Okay, as you remember, both of these drugs are lawfully marketed. So they can be considered. They've crossed that hurdle, and they can be for IND exemption. And the answer is yes. What is off-label in this case? Yes, it's pretty clear. The new drug combination is what's off-label here. So finally, what kind of documentation would you provide to the IRB and or FDA in support of an IND exemption? And really, this is where we lean into previous data, published data that speak to the safety of this drug combination. Okay, I think we have time to do this last scenario. This is with HCTPs. An investigator is planning to use peripheral blood stem cells to treat Parkinson's disease based on animal data that indicate that it could induce repair of neurologic tissue. So the peripheral blood stem cells are going to be collected from a related donor and infused into the subject the same day. Are these peripheral blood stem cells minimally manipulated? We didn't get a lot of information there, but I'm assuming that is the case. They're going to be used same day. And so we will say the answer here is yes. Now the question is the use of the peripheral blood stem cells homologous? Meaning they're used in the same way in the recipient as they will be in the donor. And the answer here is no. It's not homologous because there's insufficient evidence to support that repair of neurologic tissue is a basic function of these cells in the donor. And here's an FDA guidance that speaks to the HCTPs and hones in on minimal manipulation and homologous use. Finally, would this study require an IND? And the answer is yes. As you may recall, there was a long list, and I believe homologous use came up as the second criteria. So yes, in this case, you would need an IND. Okay, we have 6 minutes to talk about pre-INDs, so I'm going to go through those really quickly. We're going to go back to our flow chart and try to show on this flow chart the scenarios when you would want to consider having a pre-IND meeting. And obviously, if you're using an investigational drug, and particularly if you're manufacturing it, you might consider having a pre-IND meeting. And then also, if you're in that space where you're using a lawfully marketed drug off-label, and you're in that space of you may need an IND, you might want to have a pre-IND meeting. So why would you do this? Pre-IND meetings are excellent to an excellent mechanism for you to go ahead and get feedback from FDA on things like your manufacturing plan, your preclinical study, and your clinical study design. It can prevent issues during the review of your initial IND because you've already had the conversation with FDA. It's very advantageous when using a non-FDA approved drug where you control the manufacturer, but it's also very helpful in other circumstances. You would want to have a pre-IND meeting before making major manufacturing or preclinical decisions. And typically you are allowed one pre-IND meeting per IND application. When you're having a pre-IND meeting, this is your meeting. It's your opportunity to ask FDA questions. It's your opportunity to propose what you plan to do and get FDA's feedback. So this is a little flow chart of really what happens if you decided to go forward with submitting a pre-IND meeting request. So your meeting request really contains questions that you'd like FDA to answer. It's really important that you write your questions in a way that they're clear and specific and well-defined, and that you provide FDA with enough information so that they can answer your questions adequately. Your whole meeting will depend on how well you've written your questions, and your takeaway will depend on how well you've written your questions. In your meeting packet or meeting request, you can request the format of the meeting. Typically that would be face-to-face. The face-to-face meetings are starting, I believe, next week, the 13th of February for some meetings. They also can be telecon, or they can be written responses. And I will say that if they are face-to-face, FDA has stated they will be hybrid format due to the limited conference space they have. So both on FDA's side and the sponsor side, they will be hybrid, and that some people will be joining by Zoom, whereas others will be face-to-face. So once you submit your pre-IND meeting request, a clock starts. FDA will review it, and within 21 days, they will issue either a meeting granted or meeting not granted letter. Let's be positive here and assume that they are going to grant the meeting. Their meeting letter will include, if you're doing a TCON or face-to-face, the meeting format, the date, the time, location, and list of participants that will attend. If it's written response only, the meeting granted letter will tell you when they plan, the date by which they plan to get you those written responses. If you've decided that you will submit a pre-meeting briefing package, you need to get that to FDA no later than 30 days prior to the meeting or written responses. And then within 24 to 48 hours, if you are meeting by TCON or having a face-to-face meeting, FDA will send you preliminary comments. The sponsor will have the opportunity to review those, and if they find that the responses are adequate and sufficient, the sponsor can determine that they have no longer need to meet with FDA. I see this often and caution sponsors that they've done the hard work to get to meet with FDA, and they really should consider if they're leaving anything on the table. And then if they do decide to meet, you would focus on those questions that still had some discussion that was worthy. So you would really prioritize, after looking at the preliminary comments, what your discussions would be around. Then once the meeting is held, it's held within 60 days of receipt. That's the timeline for pre-IND meetings, and FDA will send official meeting minutes. So during your pre-IND meeting, typically they're 60 minutes long. You really don't want to burn your time doing things like introductions or rehashing all the information that you provided to FDA. You really want to spend the bulk of your time devoted to the questions and letting FDA talk rather than you. Again, you're prioritizing questions. You're not hiding concerns. This is your opportunity to get as much feedback as possible. You do need to limit your conversation to those topics that you've already presented to FDA in your briefing packet. We recommend that people take notes, and before ending your meeting that you summarize major decisions as well as action items. When you have your meeting, prior to the meeting, you probably want to assign who will be your scribes taking notes, who will be your spokesperson, and who will watch the clock. Finally, after your meeting, you'll want to have a debriefing with your own team. You'll want to document the decisions. You'll want to draft your own version of minutes. And then when FDA sends the official minutes to you, you can look to your minutes to make sure there's nothing that contradicts each other. So I think because we're after 1 o'clock, we will skip these. I am going to go ahead and stop sharing so that Andrea can begin hers. And having a hard time here. All right, there we go. Thank you so much for your attention.
All right, thanks, Rose. I'm just going to get my screen set up. Okay, so thanks. So my name is Andrea Burns, and I'm a regulatory affairs scientist with the Office of Regulatory Affairs and Quality. And Rose did a great job going over when studies are exempt or when you need an IND. And in this portion of the presentation, we're going to cover what's contained in the IND and how you maintain it once it becomes effective. So here is an outline of the information we're going to cover in this presentation. We'll start with some definitions and the types of INDs. We'll move into the format and content of the documents, forms that are required, how you would file the IND and what FDA's review process is like. And then once your IND is effective, how you will maintain it. And then lastly, we'll cover briefly expanded access. So the sponsor is an individual, company, academic institution, or other organization that takes responsibility for and initiates a clinical investigation. Note that a regulatory sponsor is distinct from a financial sponsor. The investigator is an individual who conducts a clinical trial or under whose immediate direction a drug is administered or dispensed. If there is a multi-site trial, then you would typically have an investigator at each trial site. If there is a team working on the trial, the investigator is the responsible leader of that team. Sponsor investigators are common in academia, and they are the individual who both initiates and conducts the investigation. There are 2 types of INDs that we're going to discuss today. At the time of submission, you will need to specify which type of IND you are submitting. The primary distinction between these 2 types of INDs is the goal of the study. If your goal is to gain marketing approval to support commercialization of a product, then you'll want to submit a commercial IND. If your goal is publication, then you would submit a research IND. Research INDs are more common in academia, and they are generally sponsored by an individual investigator, academic institution, or nonprofit entity. Now we're going to have our first poll everywhere question. So like before, you're going to go to the same place to answer these. And here's our first question. Who is ultimately responsible for monitoring the progress of clinical studies run under an IND? Okay, we're seeing a little bit of a split response here between investigator and sponsor. And here we would say that the answer to this one is the sponsor, who would have the ultimate responsibility. Investigators have some responsibility. However, it would be specific to their trial site. So if you think about a multi-site trial, there would be multiple investigators, whereas the sponsor would have that overall accountability. Okay, next, we're going to move on to IND format and content. So depending on the type of IND you're submitting, there are different formats. Commercial INDs require Electronic Common Technical Document format, or ECTD format. This format is standardized and it is accepted by ICH regulatory authorities. And the US FDA accepts this format when it is submitted electronically. And if you think about it, if you've a commercial company looking to commercialize a product and you're looking to submit your application in multiple countries, this format might be desirable. The other format is a paper submission in legacy format. Research INDs can be submitted in this format electronically. The presentation will now mainly focus on the format and content used for research INDs, but before we do that, I just wanted to touch over on what the common technical document format looks like. So this format consists of 5 separate modules, and they are often represented as a pyramid. The top of the pyramid contains administrative information. So again, because this is accepted by multiple regulatory authorities, this is the content that would vary depending on where you're submitting your application. Module 2 contains a general overview and summary of the data that will be included in the other modules. And then modules 3 through 5 contain the raw data and study reports. Module 3 is quality and manufacturing information. Module 4 will contain preclinical data, including pharmacology and toxicology. And Module 5 is where your clinical study reports would go. So now we're going to move on to the traditional IND format and content. And this slide contains suggested outline of information to include when you're using the traditional IND format. So before we discuss these sections, I want to mention that we have templates available for use, and those can be found by navigating to the URL on the screen. Also, if you go to the Duke ORAQ website, you can find it under regulatory resources. So the first thing here is the 1571, which is a cover sheet, and this is included in every IND submission. It contains sponsor contact information and describes the contents of the submission. The introductory statement contains information about the drug, including the pharmacological class, structure, formulation, and route of administration. Also, a high-level summary of the proposed clinical trial, including objectives and study duration, are provided. The general investigational plan, part 4, is where you would provide your rationale for your study and the general approach, including the dose, schedule, and patient population. The investigator's brochure is included in section 5 and is a summary of chemical, toxicological, and pharmacokinetic aspects of the investigational drug, including information on safety and efficacy from other prior trials. It would also describe any anticipated risks, side effects, and precautions. If you are running a sponsor investigator trial, you are not required to submit an investigator's brochure. And we will cover how to obtain information for the investigator's brochure, as well as the chemistry, manufacturing, and control information, and the pharmacology and toxicology information in a little bit more detail in the next couple of slides. But before we move on to those, I wanted to go down to section 11, the biosimilar user fee cover sheet. So this is only required if you are developing a generic form of a biologic. In all other cases, you would just leave this heading in your IND application and write not applicable. So where do you go to find the information needed for your IND sections for your investigator's brochure, CMC, Pharm Tox, and previous human experience? If you're using a legally marketed drug, then FDA-approved labeling may provide some of this information. If the drug is being investigated under a different IND, then you can instead provide a letter of authorization so that FDA can cross-reference this information from other filings. So what is a letter of authorization? This is a letter from a sponsor stating that confidential information from their regulatory filing can be used in support of your submission. The LOA allows FDA to access confidential information without the company disclosing that confidential information to you. So you will just get a copy of the LOA letter that you will then include in your IND submission that will allow FDA to reference this information. So now we've got our next poll everywhere question. For which drug will you most likely need a letter of authorization to support your IND? Okay, see B is taking the lead. Okay, and that is correct. So if you're using a lawfully marketed drug off-label, you'll likely be able to pull the drug-specific information from the label. And if you're using an unapproved drug made by a company, by an outside company, the information needed on the drug isn't public, so you would need an LOA to cross-reference the information. It is possible that there could be an LOA for an approved drug, but if the drug is made in your lab, then you would be the responsible party for supplying the information to the IND. So section 6 is where you would include your clinical protocol, informed consent document, and information on investigator and facilities. The investigator and facilities data are most often provided by submitting Form 1572 and the PI's CV. If this is a multi-site trial, then you would need this information for each site. The chemistry, manufacturing, and control section is what we're going to discuss next. So if you are manufacturing the drug or modifying it in any way, then you will need to provide the relevant information for this section. On our website, we have a template, an expanded template that provides details on the information needed in the CMC section if you're doing the manufacturing. The CMC section is divided into two sections, one on the drug substance, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, and the other on the drug product or the final formulated product being administered to patients. The purpose of the CMC section is to provide FDA with information that demonstrates that the final product has the proper identity, strength, quality, and purity. To demonstrate this, information is provided on the manufacturer, raw materials, the manufacturing process, any in-process testing that may occur, and the release testing. You also want to supply certificates of analysis that describes the materials used and the specifications for those materials showing that they have been met. Stability data or a plan for testing are provided to demonstrate that the material can be stored for the duration of the clinical trial. If stability testing is in process, then FDA will often accept a stability plan. And then finally, for the final drug product, you will need to supply information on the container closure system to show that it is adequate to keep the drug pure and safe. Example labeling is also provided, and it must say, caution, new drug limited by federal law to investigational use. If you're at Duke and your investigational drug product is not managed by IDS, there is a Duke policy on drug handling and labeling that you should consult. Next, we're going to touch on Section 8, pharmacology and toxicology data. If you're manufacturing the drug for your study or modifying a drug product in any way, then you will need to provide adequate pharmacology and toxicology data. The studies required depend on what you're proposing in your clinical study and consider the route of administration, dosage, dosing schedule, and patient population. The data should be sufficient to support the sponsor investigator's conclusion that is reasonably safe to conduct the proposed clinical trial. If you are doing a first-in-human study, then generally IND-enabling toxicity studies would be needed to provide foundational safety data. These studies are conducted under good laboratory practice. A full panel of pharmacology and toxicology data are required before submitting a marketing application, but the full panel is not required for an IND submission. If your product has already been used in humans, then additional pharmacology or toxicology studies may not be needed. It's case by case, depending on the information you have available and your study plans. Next, we're going to cover previous human experience. The previous human experience section is similar to a literature review. So any published material relevant to the safety of the proposed trial or to an assessment of the drug's effectiveness for its proposed investigational use should be provided. You can include literature on the same indication, a different indication, or a different route of administration. Unpublished data can be used as long as it's made available to FDA. If there's no previous experience with the drug, then it may be useful to provide information on a drug with a similar mode of action. Next, we're going to cover the forms that are included in an IND application. So there are three main forms that are needed: the 1571, the 1572, and the 3674. So before we talk about what these are, I want to mention that the best practice for the forms are to download those directly from the FDA website, which is at the bottom of the page. These forms expire or get updated over time, so downloading is the best way to make sure you have the correct version. So the 1571, in addition to being a cover sheet to your submission, it is an agreement between FDA and the sponsor to follow all FDA regulations. The 1572, which provides facilities and investigator information, also serves as an agreement between the investigator and sponsor. In signing it, the investigator is agreeing to conduct the study according to the protocol and all applicable regulations. Even if you are a sponsor investigator, this form is still required. The 3674 is certification of compliance or registration with clinicaltrials.gov. At Duke, Docker is the department that will help you with this registration. So which clinical trials need to be registered on clinicaltrials.gov? FDA wants all applicable clinical trials to be registered. A trial qualifies as an applicable clinical trial if it meets all four of these criteria. It is an interventional study. It evaluates an FDA-regulated drug, biologic, or device. It's within the US FDA's jurisdiction, and it is a phase 2 through 4 trial. There's a link at the bottom of this page for the ACT checklist, which walks you through these criteria in a little bit more detail. Even if you are not required, even if your applicable clinical trial, you can voluntarily register your trial with clinicaltrials.gov. So even if it's not required, you can voluntarily do this. Many medical journals require registration for publication, and this is to ensure compliance with an International Committee of Medical Journal Editors policy. Also, if clinical trials are funded in whole or in part by the NIH, they should be registered to ensure compliance with NIH policy. So there are deadlines associated with registering your trial, depending on which agency or policy you're trying to comply with. Before we go over the table, I want to point out that these timelines are based on regulations, and institutional policies may be different, so be sure to check on that. If you're registering to meet the requirements for an applicable clinical trial or NIH funding, then the deadlines are the same. You should register the trial no later than 21 days after enrolling the first patient, and you must update clinicaltrials.gov at least every 12 months. You are required to report results within 12 months of the primary completion date. If you are registering to meet the requirements for publishing, then you must register prior to enrolling the first patient, and reporting of results is encouraged rather than required. So now you have all the information needed and you're ready to submit your IND. So we're going to go over how that's done and also the FDA review process. So you're going to include with your IND application a cover letter. It tells FDA what is included in the submission and identifies primary and alternate contacts. You can use the cover letter as an opportunity to include any specific questions that you have for FDA. And we have an example template on our website. For traditional INDs, these can be submitted as paper or electronically. A merged PDF can be submitted through the electronic submission gateway. If you have a CEDAR regulated product, then you can also make an electronic submission through the CEDAR NextGen portal. With the CEDAR NextGen portal, you submit multiple files rather than a single merged PDF. An ECTD submission is made through the electronic submission gateway, and this submission will contain multiple documents that cross-reference each other. So this slide is specific to those of you at Duke. All Duke-sponsored regulatory submissions to the FDA must be reviewed and submitted by ORAQ. This includes initial and maintenance submissions. Study teams are encouraged to prepare the submissions and then send them to ORAQ for review. Copies of all FDA correspondence should also be sent to ORAQ for record keeping. Our office submits INDs electronically using either the full ECTD format or more commonly as a non-CTD submission through the ESG. After submission, we provide the final merged PDF to the study team for their records. So after submitting an initial IND, the sponsor will receive an acknowledgement letter, and this is received usually within a week or two. It can be sent by mail, email, or fax, and will contain the assigned review division, the IND number, the division contact, and the official date of receipt. The official date of receipt starts a 30-day clock for FDA to review the IND. FDA will assemble a review team that is appropriate to the content of your submission, and this team will include clinical reviewers, chemists, toxicologists, etc. And they will examine the IND. Their primary objective during this review period is to protect the rights and safety of study participants. After FDA's review, with the ideal outcome, you will have an IND that will go into effect. An IND goes into effect 30 days after the official date of receipt, unless FDA notifies the sponsor that the study has been placed on clinical hold. It is also possible that they could notify you that your study may proceed before the 30-day clock ends, but it is not typical for FDA to send letters informing you that your IND is in effect. Instead, you can go ahead and assume that the 30th day after receipt is your effective date. However, it's a good practice to confirm the effective date with FDA before starting so that you ensure you haven't missed any communications. And just as a reminder, even if you have FDA approval, you still need IRB approval to legally begin your study. Alternatively, it is also possible that FDA will contact the sponsor to request additional information during the 30-day review period. So this is why it's important to have that alternate contact submitted in your cover letter. Often a commitment to provide, a commitment in writing to provide FDA with the requested information will often preclude a clinical hold. So for example, if FDA asks for testing on the drug product that takes a long time, it's possible that committing to perform the test in writing may be sufficient for the FDA to not put the study on clinical hold. You can usually respond to these requests for information by email to your FDA division contact, and then later formally submit the response to your IND as an amendment. If FDA's concerns cannot be resolved within the 30-day review period, FDA will place the study on clinical hold. This happens when FDA thinks that subjects would be exposed to unreasonable or significant risk, or that the IND application doesn't contain sufficient information to properly assess the risk. When a clinical hold has been placed, FDA will notify the sponsor of a clinical hold by phone, email, or through some other means of rapid communication. The sponsor will also receive an official letter within 30 days. This letter will explicitly state why the clinical hold was placed and what information needs to be provided to FDA to get off clinical hold. The sponsor will then need to address the clinical hold comments in writing and submit a complete response to the IND, which starts a new 30-day review clock. The hold is lifted once FDA notifies the applicant that the investigation may proceed. And in this case, you should make sure to verify the IND effective date, since this will be important for annual reporting requirements. So just to recap, when you submit an IND, the FDA will respond with an acknowledgement letter. They have 30 days to review your submission and request more information. If they are satisfied, there will be no response, or they will tell you that your study may proceed. Or if they're not satisfied at the end of the 30-day review, the study will be placed on clinical hold. To resolve the clinical hold, the sponsor must put together a complete response, which starts another 30-day clock for their review. So we're going to go now to another poll everywhere question. The FDA requests additional manufacturing information before the 30-day IND review is complete. What is the best solution? Okay. Everyone coming in with A. And so these are all possible solutions. So A is the best option, assuming it's feasible and you have the information that they're requesting. B is also fine if you need more time to gather the information or the data that they've requested. And C and D are not necessarily wrong, depending on your situation. In academia, it's okay to be put on clinical hold, especially since you'll be provided with a detailed letter on the information that is specifically required to move forward with your study. Okay, now we're going to cover IND maintenance. So you've got your IND in effect, you've got to maintain it. As we've discussed, Form 1571 is included with every IND submission, and this is a screenshot of box 11 on this form, where you indicate what is contained in your submission. There are 4 different categories: annual reports, protocol amendments, information amendments, and IND safety reports. We're going to talk about each of these document categories in more detail. So first, for annual reports, these are due within 60 days of the anniversary of the IND effective date. For those of you at Duke, once your IND is registered with our office, you'll get automatic messages reminding you about your annual report due date. And again, we have templates on our website for use for annual reporting purposes. The content of the annual report generally includes, Here we go, sorry. The content of the annual report generally includes the following information: individual study information, including demographic information on subjects and the status of enrolled subjects; summary information, including updates on all clinical and non-clinical investigations from the previous year; a summary of adverse events and any manufacturing changes; an update to general investigational plan or the investigator's brochure if there are any. You can submit any protocol changes if they weren't submitted in real time as an amendment. And if there are any foreign marketing developments like approval or withdrawal of the drug, you can indicate those there. In the last section of the annual report, the sponsor can log any outstanding business with the FDA for which the sponsor requests or expects a reply, comment, or meeting. If there are multiple protocols, then this information is needed for each protocol. Once an IND is in effect, the sponsor is required to amend it to ensure that the clinical investigation is conducted in accordance with the protocol. Protocol amendments may be implemented after submission to the FDA and following review and approval from the IRB. You can submit the amendment to the FDA or IRB in either order. However, for any major protocol changes, you're encouraged to wait at least 30 days before implementing those changes to give FDA time for review. In some cases, you may wish to check with your FDA project manager before proceeding with the change to avoid a potential clinical hold. Protocol amendments are reviewed by FDA upon receipt. However, FDA will usually reply only if there are concerns around the submitted information. If the sponsor desires FDA to comment on the protocol amendment, a request for comment and specific questions should be included in the cover letter of the submission. So moving on to protocol amendments, there are 5 types of protocol amendments: new protocol, change in protocol, new investigator, post-marketing requirements and commitments, and human factors protocols. We'll discuss these first 3 in more detail. An IND may contain multiple protocols. You would see this if each protocol covers the same drug and a similar indication. If a sponsor intends to conduct a study that is not covered by a protocol already contained in the IND, the sponsor is required to submit to FDA a protocol amendment containing the new protocol. Along with the new protocol, the amendment should include a brief description of clinically significant differences between the new protocol and previous protocols. The IND sponsor is also expected to submit a protocol amendment when changes to the existing protocol could significantly affect the safety of subjects, the scope of the investigation, or the scientific quality of the study. Although the regulations specified certain types of changes that must be reported, we find it a best practice to submit all changes to the FDA to ensure the protocol contained within an IND remains up to date and accurate. An amendment should contain a brief description of the change. This could be described in a cover letter, a standalone document, or a record of change as part of the updated protocol. Often both the clean and red line version of the protocol is provided in the submission for ease of FDA review. You should reference by date and serial number the submission that contained the original protocol. Please note that in an emergency, a protocol change may be implemented before notifying FDA, provided that the change is intended to eliminate an immediate hazard to human subjects. FDA must be notified subsequently by submitting a change in protocol amendment, and the reviewing IRB must also be notified. If you add a new investigator to carry out a protocol that was previously submitted to the IND, then you would add this investigator by submitting a new investigator protocol amendment. This may occur with the addition of a new site in the case of a multi-site study, or with change in investigator at an existing site. The amendment should include the investigator information and qualifications to conduct the investigation. Most often, this is provided by submitting the investigator's CV in the form FDA 1572. FDA should be notified within 30 days of the investigator being added to the study. Let's go to another poll everywhere question. A clinical protocol amendment is submitted to an IND. When can the changes to the study be implemented? Okay, most people are getting this correct. The answer here is C. So you always need IRB approval in addition to submission to the IND. Here's another question. In which situation is it most important to give FDA time to respond to a protocol amendment before putting an IRB approved protocol change in place? Most people are picking D, and I would agree this is the most risky. So you want to make sure you allow adequate time for review by FDA. Okay, information amendments. Information amendments are any amendment to an IND application with information essential to the product that is not within the scope of a protocol amendment, safety report, or annual report. These amendments should be submitted as needed, but if possible, they should be consolidated so that they aren't submitted more than once every 30 days. Information amendments are categorized based on the type of information included within the submission. For example, there are amendments for chemistry, microbiology, pharmacology, toxicology, clinical safety, clinical pharmacology, and statistics. So as an example, if there is a change to product manufacturing once the IND is in effect, updated information about the manufacturing process should be provided in a chemistry information amendment. Per regulations, any information amendment submitted under an IND application is required to bear identification of its contents in the cover letter. So here is an example. You can specify the type of information amendment in the subject line of your cover letter. The information amendment should also contain a statement of the purpose of the amendment and an organized submission of the data that enables scientific review. If the sponsor desires FDA feedback on the information amendment, they should include comments and specific questions in the cover letter of their submission. Okay, the fourth document category are safety reports. There are initial written reports and follow-up to written reports. IND sponsors are responsible for promptly reviewing all available information relevant to the safety of the drug to determine if the information meets the criteria for a safety report. IND safety reports must be submitted for serious and unexpected adverse reactions that are associated with the use of the drug product. Any clinically relevant increase in the occurrence of a serious suspected adverse reaction associated with the drug should be reported. Findings from other studies or from animal or in vitro testing that suggest a significant risk to humans will also need to be submitted to FDA in a safety report. Other relevant information that does not meet these criteria should be submitted as an information amendment or included in the annual report. The definition of an adverse event is any untoward medical occurrence associated with the use of a drug in humans, whether or not considered drug-related. Adverse events can be further classified as serious, unexpected, and associated with the drug. We're going to go over how adverse events are assessed and who is responsible for classifying them. So this diagram is meant to highlight that a large number of adverse events may occur, but only a subset of these are possibly related to the study drug, and an even smaller subset can actually be classified as adverse reactions to the drug. An adverse event is considered to be associated with the use of the drug if there is a reasonable possibility that the drug caused the adverse event. This is also referred to as a suspected adverse reaction. Reasonable possibility means that there is evidence to suggest a causal relationship between the drug and the adverse event. It is the sponsor's responsibility to evaluate the available evidence and make a judgment about the likelihood that the drug caused the adverse event. The sponsor may overrule the investigator's assessment. A serious adverse event is defined as an adverse event occurring at any dose that, in the view of either the investigator or the sponsor, results in any of the following outcomes: death, a life-threatening situation, inpatient hospitalization or prolongation of existing hospitalization, a persistent or significant disability or incapacity, or a congenital anomaly or birth defect. Other important medical events may be considered serious when they jeopardize the subject and require medical or surgical intervention to prevent one of the outcomes listed above. Examples of such medical events include allergic reactions requiring intensive treatment or development of drug dependency or drug abuse. An adverse event is considered unexpected if the specificity or severity of the event is not consistent with the current investigator's brochure or package insert. Or if there is no investigator's brochure, an adverse event is unexpected if the specificity or severity of the event is not consistent with the risk information in the IND. As an example, hepatic necrosis would be unexpected by virtue of greater severity if the investigator's brochure referred only to elevated hepatic enzymes or hepatitis. When new adverse event information is received, it is the sponsor's responsibility to determine whether the event is unexpected for IND safety reporting purposes. If it is determined that an adverse event meets the criteria for a written IND safety report, the sponsor must submit the report to FDA within specific timelines based on the information being reported. IND safety reports are categorized as 7-day reports, 15-day reports, and follow-up reports. Safety reports for unexpected fatal or life-threatening adverse reactions must be reported as soon as possible, but no later than 7 calendar days after the sponsor's initial receipt of the information. Unexpected serious adverse reactions that are not fatal or life-threatening must be reported within 15 calendar days after the sponsor receives the information. New findings that suggest significant risk to human subjects must also be reported within 15 calendar days. Any additional information obtained by the sponsor that pertains to a previously submitted IND safety report must be submitted as a follow-up safety report as soon as the information is available, but no later than 15 calendar days after the sponsor receives the information. Safety reports are most often submitted to the IND by completing Form FDA 3500A, also known as the MedWatch form for mandatory reporting. The IND safety report should include a brief narrative describing the adverse event and any other relevant information. Each IND safety report must also identify all safety reports previously submitted to the IND concerning similar adverse events and analyze the significance of the adverse event in light of previous reports. If the sponsor holds multiple INDs for the drug, the safety report should be submitted to all of the sponsor's INDs under which the drug is being administered. So here's another practice question. Here's the scenario for safety reporting scenario 1. In a clinical study, drug Danulera is injected intramuscularly every week for 3 months. During the second month, a subject reports peripheral numbness and tingling. The patient is discontinued from treatment and stays in the study for safety follow-up. After 2 months of follow-up, the numbness is not resolved or improved. The investigator did not characterize the event as life-threatening, but evaluated the event as probably related to Danulera. The investigator's brochure indicates that Danulera can cause peripheral numbness that resolves within a few days. Is this event serious? Okay, so that's overwhelming. Yes, so we would defer to physician's judgment, but this would be considered serious because the adverse event can be considered persistent or significant disability or incapacity. Is this event unexpected based on the information in the Danulera investigator's brochure? Okay, we're coming out about even on this one. So the answer here is yes. So based on the investigator's brochure, the numbness is expected to be short-lived, and the patient observed the symptom with greater severity than what was described in the investigator's brochure. Is the event related to the study drug? Okay, and most people here are saying yes, so it's probably related per the sponsor's determination. How and when would this event be reported to the FDA? Okay, the answer here is a 15-day safety report because it was serious, unexpected, and associated with the study drug. So this would be reported more than 15 days since onset because the event did not initially qualify as serious until its long-lasting nature became apparent. What would be the reporting timeline if the numbness became widespread and led to difficulty breathing, which became life-threatening? Everybody's getting that one correct. So 7-day IND safety report. Here's another reporting scenario. A study subject is receiving investigational drug ORAQ to treat a soft tissue sarcoma. The subject was prescribed pain medicine as a part of her standard of care and decides to double her pain medicine dose. That evening, the subject becomes lightheaded and faints and is admitted to the ICU where she is diagnosed with hypotension. She receives treatment and is released the next day. Hypotension is not listed in the investigator's brochure for ORAQ. The reporting physician assessed the event as likely related to an overdose of her pain medicine and not related to ORAQ. Is this event serious? Most people are going yes, and I would agree, since the patient was hospitalized, this would be considered serious. Is this event unexpected based on the information in the ORAQ investigator's brochure? I would agree that would also be yes, is not listed in the brochure. Is this event related to the study drug? Most people are saying no here, and that I would agree, related only to the pain medicine overdose. That was per the investigator's judgment and the sponsor's agreement. Okay. How and when should this event be reported to the FDA? Okay, we're getting a mixed response here. So this would go in the annual report because it is not related to the study drug. Okay, so moving on to the end of an IND. Finally, at the end, you will withdraw. The IND can be withdrawn by the sponsor for any reason, such as completion of the trial. This is permanent, and the IND cannot be reactivated after it's withdrawn. If you were wanting to do additional work, you'd have to submit a new IND. If the IND is withdrawn for safety reasons, then the IRB must also be notified. Alternatively, the IND can be given an inactive status, which is initiated by either the sponsor or FDA. So maybe if you're waiting for funding and you don't anticipate on starting, you can go into an inactive status. FDA may choose to inactivate the IND if no subjects are entered into clinical studies in 2 years, or if the investigation remains on clinical hold for over a year. If an IND is inactive, the sponsor is not required to submit an annual report, and it may be reactivated by submitting a protocol amendment. INDs that are inactive for over 5 years are at risk of being terminated. Termination of an IND is initiated by FDA, and it's typically based on safety issues, deficiencies in the IND, or deficiencies in the conduct of an investigation. Usually the sponsor will have a chance to respond to FDA in this situation. Okay, now we're going to move on to expanded access. Expanded access involves the use of investigational drugs outside of clinical trials for treatment purposes. Expanded access is also commonly referred to as compassionate use or treatment use, and the primary goal is treatment of 1 or more patients as opposed to research. Expanded access is generally considered when enrollment in an ongoing clinical trial is not possible. FDA requirements for expanded access are: a patient must have a serious, immediately life-threatening condition with no satisfactory alternative treatments. The potential benefit justifies potential risks, and potential risks are not unreasonable in the context of the condition or disease. Access will not interfere with clinical investigations to support marketing approval. And also, the investigator must have approval from the drug company and IRB. There are several categories of expanded access. Expanded access for individual patients, which includes emergency use. If FDA receives a significant number of individual patient requests for the same use, then they may ask the sponsor to consolidate these requests into an intermediate size patient population request. Intermediate size patient populations include 2 to a few hundred patients. So this might be appropriate if the drug is not being developed, for example, because the disease or condition is so rare that the sponsor is unable to recruit patients for a clinical trial, or if the drug is being studied, but patients are unable to participate in the trial because maybe they have a different disease or stage of disease than the one being studied. Expanded access for large patient populations, which is also referred to as treatment IND. This type of expanded access may be relevant if the sponsor is actively pursuing a marketing approval of the drug for the expanded access use, and there is sufficient clinical evidence or safety and effectiveness data to support the expanded access use. This kind of expanded access often bridges the gap between when clinical trials of the drug are complete, but market approval is still in process. Any of these requests can be submitted as a new IND or as a new protocol under an existing IND. The type of expanded access request that you submit will dictate when treatment can begin. In an emergency situation, treatment can begin with verbal authorization from FDA. In this case, the IND submission needs to be sent to FDA within 15 working days of verbal authorization. For non-emergent individual patient or intermediate size population requests submitted to an existing IND, treatment can begin immediately after submission and with IRB chair concurrence or approval. If these same requests are submitted as an expanded access IND, you need to wait 30 days to begin treatment. All treatment INDs also require that you wait 30 days from submission to begin treatment. So the form that's generally included with individual patient expanded access is the 3926. And this was created to simplify the process of requesting individual patient expanded access by reducing the number of attachments and time burden. Form 1571 was seen as overly complicated and not a great fit for physicians requesting expanded access. It still can be used and is required under some circumstances. You will also need to submit with your expanded access request a letter of authorization. The IND regulations do not specifically require submission to FDA of the consent form with the IND application. However, if FDA determines that review of the consent form is necessary to make the determination of whether the clinical investigation may safely proceed, the agency will request that the sponsor submit the consent form for review. If you are at Duke, there is a resource that assists physicians in obtaining expanded access for individual patients. So if you go to the ORAQ website, you will find a survey to request support, and you just click on that green button there. The service provides support with the following steps in the approval process. The Duke University Hospital Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee will review all requests for individual patient expanded access and grant approval for utilization of non-FDA approved medications per institutional policy. Our office will assist with obtaining approval from the drug company for the expanded access use. We will also work with Duke Office of Research Contracts to ensure proper contractual and confidential disclosure agreements are in place for the expanded access use. Our office will also prepare and submit the individual patient IND application to the FDA and will assist with maintaining that application once the investigational use has been authorized. A core of regulatory coordinators will assist with drafting an informed consent document and will process the IRB application through IRIS to receive IRB chair concurrence for the expanded access use. Investigational drug service will be involved in receiving, storing, and preparing the investigational drug. An analyst will build an order in MaestroCare so that the drug can be ordered and documented in the patient's medical record. So as a means to organize and expedite the workflow, the requesting physician will be informed of progress via email notifications at each step of the process. All individual patient expanded access requests will be supported by this resource, including both emergency and non-emergency use situations. Duke is working to expand its support of expanded access to programs with intermediate-sized patient populations. These larger programs are more complex and require more sophisticated workflows and additional support staff. While this support is under construction, we are accepting submissions through an individual patient IND request survey. You can also reach out to ORAQ@duke.edu if you're interested in sponsoring or participating as an investigator on a larger expanded access program. So before we close the meeting, I just wanted to share that our team is hiring. There is an open position for a regulatory affairs scientist within our group. So if you are interested in more information about that role, you can click on the link here or contact by email, the ORAQ@duke.edu. So thanks everyone for participating in the polls and the presentation today. We'll be sending out a short survey in the next couple of days to get any feedback on the presentation, and we would appreciate your feedback. Thanks so much. Were there any questions that were left over? Okay. If not, I think we'll close the meeting. Thanks, everyone.